with other formations. So the central themes around the index and indexing the human are still very much alive in this theme. And so we're very excited to have Michael here because his work on family and marriage and law specifically, I found very stimulating for thinking through my own work in relationship to marriage and kinship in South Africa. But I think it has powerful connections with our Index of the Human project more generally. So I haven't got the flyers, we'll print some more, but please look at our website, Indexing the Human website, indexingthehuman.org, to get a sense of the other seminars. But so Michael, we've got about 45 minutes for a paper, and then we'll have 40 minutes or so for Q&A after that. And so tell us a little about yourself as well. When you get going.
Sure. Thanks all for having me. Thank you very much, Thomas, for this invitation and for being here. What I'm going to be talking about today is related to a long, ongoing project that I'm starting to finally bring to completion. It's the sort of draft. It's drawn from the draft of the first chapter of a book project that I'm doing, and I'll get more into what the whole project is about as the talk continues. Just so you know, sort of where I'm located, I'm coming from New York, where I teach in a law and society major. So I teach in the field of sort of interdisciplinary social science approaches to law in a college, John Jay College of Criminal Justice, that, as Thomas mentioned, is a law and justice focused undergraduate institution where most of my students want to go on to be lawyers, and so I'm kind of giving them a sort of social science approach to how to think about questions of law and justice before they go on to be lawyers, or perhaps they decide not to be lawyers after having my class. And my training is in law. I have a law degree, but primarily in sociology. So my PhD is in sociology, and you'll see in the talk that I'm giving, in a sense, that the sort of main, as my advisor puts it, frenemy whom I'm addressing, comes from within sociology, particularly sociology of the family, as it's practiced in the US. So that's kind of my main interlocutor. I don't expect them to listen much to me, but as a kind of literary device, that's sort of whom I'm addressing, trying to bring in questions about and techniques from the sociology of law and political sociology to the way we think about family sociology. I also draw in developing these arguments in a kind of wide range of interdisciplinary work. So my work sort of straddles anthropology through sociology into a little bit of political science and feminist and queer theory. So the main point of the framework that I want to present to you today, this is the sort of theoretical framework that I'm trying to hang the rest of the book on, and it's supposed to be the main contribution of the book. The main point of that theoretical framework is to try to propose a new way of conceptualizing this category that's really critical to family sociology, the category of marital status. And I'm not going to tell you just yet how I want to reconceptualize that. First, I would like to read you a story from my fieldwork. I'm ideologically opposed to reading papers, and I'm not going to read this entire paper, but I'm going to break my principles for a moment to read you this story that I think sets up what's at stake in this paper quite well. It's a story of the first time I met a woman I call Ma Khumalo. And this is outside of Pietermaritzburg, by the way, in a village called Mkongo. As I first approached Ma Khumalo's homestead, I found it hard to place. A spiral necklace of razor wire crowned the high wall, protecting her dusty yard from the dangers of the village road. Through the white metal teeth of the main gate, my research assistant called for Ma Khumalo's teenage son, who opened the heavy padlock and guided us across the yard into an unfinished hallway flanked by ghostly shells of future rooms. A winter wind blew through the walls and into the glass pendants of a small chandelier, sprinkling out a serenade onto the construction debris below. The hallway led us into a cold, dark kitchen where we met Ma Khumalo emerging from her bedroom, marked out to our right with a partial mud wall. My research assistant and I sat at the kitchen table, each place set with a cloth placemat protected by an old newspaper neatly folded on top. In pastel shades of rose and blue, a picture of the Virgin Mary looked out upon us from the back wall. The son crossed over to a mattress on our left, watching a Nigerian soap opera on TV while he toyed with his cell phone. The kitchen held few hints of the relative prosperity suggested by the homestead's heavy security, typical of South Africa's primarily white middle-class suburbs, but not its overwhelmingly black, largely poor rural villages. The confusion increased once the interview began. Having been told by the grandmother of my host family that Ma Khumalo's husband had left her, I proceeded gingerly. I don't know what your family situation is. You're married or not, or I'm married, she replied. It wasn't what I had expected to hear, but her words sat there before me, solid and certain. She fell in love with her husband in 1988, she continued, and a few months later he began sending Bridewell cattle to her father's homestead. Following the standard custom, 10 cattle were given in total, 6 as actual cows and 4 as a negotiated amount of cash. Other gifts and ceremonies followed over the next 2 years until she and her husband were married by Father Stevens in a mission church on October 14, 1991. A Zulu ceremony followed in 1993. For a decade and a half, she lived with her husband and 3 children in a nearby village on their own homestead near her husband's family. In 2006, her husband began to see a new girlfriend he met at work. He left home, leaving Makumalo to raise their children. Sadness suffused her voice. I stayed, she told me, even while he didn't want to give us food or bring us money. In 2007, I went to a court, but this is a civil court in town. I went to request financial support. Her request succeeded, and he began to send money. She continued in that vein until 2009, when a policeman, and she declared to me a crook, arrived with court papers from her husband requesting a divorce. She signed to acknowledge receipt of the papers, but not to accept the divorce. The same routine repeated itself twice more in the following months, but her resolve, she giggled with rising spirits, did not waver. Eventually, she approached her father to request a homestead of her own on his property. He agreed, and she moved back to her natal village of Makongo, where we now spoke, in 2011. In February of that year, her husband tried a 4th time for divorce. She was still reluctant, but her priest advised her to accept. To access your rights and keep your children, she recalled him telling her, sign the paper for your husband. He said it was right for me to sign because it was my husband who put us in this problem. Also, this doesn't mean that because you will sign that it is over, that your marriage is over. The marriage will stand forever. Her, the woman he'll now marry, that's a thing in the wind, a thing that doesn't exist. It's a marriage only of the 2 of them, a thing in the wind. You build your life and rights for yourself. And so she did. To the blame from her father, she added money from her husband, beginning to build the homestead in progress I was now hearing her speak, beginning to place. From certain vantage points, Makumalo's professed marital status is as hard to place as I found her homestead. How can she be married when she's divorced? Isn't that just her own convenient fiction? She did sign the papers, after all. This perspective holds a great deal of truth. It was divorce that enabled Makumalo to access her husband's money and to choose how to spend it. The land on which she was investing that money also came through estrangement, if not legal divorce, granted by her father to facilitate her move away from her husband's family. Like so many South African women today, her daily life was that of a single mother. But her divorce set her apart, giving her some access to material resources and a story her neighbors viewed with more sympathy than scorn. At the same time, though, Makumalo was not wrong to call herself married. No less an authority than her Catholic priest had assured her that the marriage remained intact, despite the civil divorce. Her parish tacitly honored this interpretation every Sunday when she not only took communion, but helped administer it, a distinction not easily offered someone held responsible for ending her marriage. She similarly saw herself as still married in terms of Zulu culture. Indeed, it was only by finding a way to maintain this self-understanding that she agreed to sign the papers at all. Only by remaining married could she get divorced. Now, there are many ways that one could look at this story. And one way that would come from family sociology in the US and perhaps in other locations would be to say that this is a kind of puzzle with one answer. Either she's married or she's divorced. What is the right answer? There are many reasons I think this is not the way to approach her story, that I think it's wrong. One set of reasons that it's wrong would be familiar to many of us in this room, and that has to do with the nature of African customary marriage traditionally. The idea that it's a negotiated process that emerges through interaction, and that marriage is, as classically put in the anthropological literature, a process, not an event. Now, this by itself is likely to be a difficult sell to the audiences I imagine for this book project, most of whom will be coming from the US and will not be able to wrap their head around it. How can you be married and divorced at the same time? Either you're married or you're not. And that is part of the story that I want to tell in this book. But the bigger agenda that I'm trying to advance here is to use the case of African customary marriage to reformulate the way we think about marriage and marital status in general. So the main argument of this book project is that marriage, and specifically marital status, the status of being married, that it is always a process, but it's a process that in some contexts appears to be an event. And so then the question becomes, what are the social processes that allow it to appear as an event, and how can we use that to rethink marital status more generally? I think this move is necessary, not just because I think it's accurate, that I tend to see marital status not as a characteristic, but as something that's produced through social action. But more importantly, what I'm trying to do with reformulating marital status in this way is to enable a more critical way of framing marital status as a characteristic, and therefore research it in more critical ways, meaning understanding the way that it's entangled with intersecting hierarchies of gender, sexuality, race, class, coloniality, and so forth. So in a sense, my agenda in this project is similar to the agenda of this seminar series, to move from classification to critical politics of transformation. And South Africa is a great place to engage in this kind of project. Not only because this processual idea of marriage still continues to circulate in some contexts unevenly and incompletely, but nonetheless one can find it in various places across South Africa, but also for another set of reasons, which was the one that brought me to the project in the first place, which is that South Africa is the only jurisdiction in the world where not one but two groups of people have recently expanded access to state recognition for their marriages under state marriage law. And the one group is one that's more familiar to most of the people around the world, which is same-sex couples, people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and or transgender, who have been able to marry under state law since 2006, when the Civil Union Act was passed in response to a series of constitutional litigation. And then, of course, customary marriages have become recognized by the state fully for the first time since the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act, which was brought into operation in 2001, passed in 1998. So lots of places have same-sex couples who can now newly marry. Among that list, South Africa is the only place in the world where you've got another group of people, an intersecting group of people, it's important to add, but another group of people who also have recently expanded access to state marriage law. So coming from where I'm coming, where what's assumed to define whether one's married or not is whether one's married in the eyes of their state, South Africa is the one place in the world where you can actually do fine-grained comparative research to see how are these changing state definitions infiltrating or not the way that people understand marriage in their own everyday lives. And that's what I've been doing for very, very many years now. So the project that forms the core of the book is focused on research among people who are members of either or both of these two groups who now have new access to state marriage law. For people who identify as LGBT, I did most of that research in Johannesburg and also to a lesser extent here in Cape Town. And then, as you've already heard, for customary marriage, I'm looking specifically at one context, the village of Makongo outside of Pietermaritzburg and in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. And in both of those contexts, the main thing I was trying to do was to interview people about the important relationships in their own everyday lives. Within that, to understand where marriage fits in, if at all, into that complex of relationships. And then within that, where is the state? And the two main sort of descriptive questions that I take to that interview data in order to understand how it links to the research question is, first, is state recognition the criterion by which married and unmarried relationships are distinguished from each other? Is it that the state sees you as married, or is it something else that defines whether you're married or not? And second, more diffusely, are legal discourses, state legal discourses, influencing the meanings that are attributed to marriage by members of these two social groups? So this is things like, what is the function of marriage in the course of an individual life course? What's the purpose of marriage for society as a whole? What does an ideal marriage look like? What does a bad marriage look like? How does marriage relate to similar categories like cohabitation? Where does the line get drawn? How are they seen to relate to each other? So through these interviews and a series of participant observation sort of techniques in ceremonies, community events, political events, and so forth, I've been trying to explore these two questions within the set of people that I've been working with. And in line behind all of this is a set of archival interview research with activists, lawmakers, judges, and so forth, who contributed to the making of the laws. The upshot of these questions for the comparison is not particularly surprising, and that's that state recognition was much, much more important for LGBT identified people than it was for people living in Makongo. that for LGBT identified people, even if they themselves had ambivalent or critical attitudes towards state marriage and state recognition, they thought it was absolutely essential to have that recognition in order for their relationships to be recognized as such by people in their own communities. Whereas Macomo, this is not at all what defines marriage. What defines marriage is processes primarily of lobola. That whether one is married or not has to do with whether the lobola has been begun, how far it's gotten, and if a ceremony has been completed at its end to mark the completion of the marriage. And anything outside of that is not regarded as marriage within that particular community, even if it's been registered in the bureaucracy of the Department of Home Affairs. Instead, people frequently spoke about going to Home Affairs with a kind of bureaucratic language of putting it in the computer as a way to get a marriage that already existed, put it in the computer so that you could prove that it existed to other people, but not what was necessary to create the marriage as such. The marriage existed with or without that particular recognition. Now, underneath this broad comparison, there's a lot of nuance and variation within the two groups, and even some irony, some of which might come up in the discussion that I'll get into in a bit. And what I'm trying to do in this project is come up with a framework that allows us to illuminate and understand as much of both the headline comparison between the two groups and also the nuances and ironies within them as possible. And this is how I've started to go about it. As I've argued, the main point of this book is that marital status is always a process, although it's sometimes a process that appears as an event. And the way I think about this process is as unfolding in multiple spheres. And I've developed a sort of three-step framework for thinking about how those processes relate to each other and to articulate those processes with each other. The first step of the framework is to insist that marital status classifications primarily occur not in official institutions, but primarily in the domain of everyday life. In spaces of work, community, home, neighbors, that through everyday interaction, through what someone like Michelle Lamont would call boundary work, there's a constant set of processes by which people are assigning, presuming, and thereby constituting people as married, as living together, divorced, and so forth. And that this is the main set of actions that produces the reality of marital status. I insist on the primacy of the everyday for a couple reasons. One is that the overwhelming bulk of the social action, if you just were to quantify it, that actually produces marital status, this is the domain in which it happens. It's not very frequent that people go into official spaces to seek recognition. That does happen, of course, but most of it happens in everyday life. The other is that the consequences that come along with marital status are most frequently and most immediately lived in this context. Now, these can be consequences that are conditioned by the institutional context, and to be sure, I'm going to be getting there soon, but whether one has access to land or to sex or to the labor power of one's spouse or to the respect that comes with being married or unmarried, most of that happens in the immediate context that one lives out on a day-to-day basis. So I've argued that this happens through acts of recognition, and I'll get into what that means in a moment. The second step is to acknowledge that, of course, institutions do matter to these processes. And they matter because these everyday acts of recognition are consequential in ways that tend to attract struggles to shape them by a range of social actors, especially elites, but not only elites, also non-elites engaged in these processes of struggle. And then in order to affect this shaping of everyday acts of recognition, people tend to turn to large-scale regulatory institutions that have the capacities and technologies necessary to shape these actions, including the state, religious institutions, and cultural institutions such as the lobola. We could also throw in here commercial institutions like the workplace, right? Employers would also be at play here. And eventually these struggles tend to resolve, I argue, into a relatively stable equilibrium that constitutes a local marital status regime. So there's times that are unsettled of struggle, and then eventually at some point that struggle tends to resolve, justly or unjustly. This is not necessarily a normative claim, but tends to resolve into a set of taken for granted expectations about how marital status will be defined in everyday life, and that once that happens, and to the extent that happens, what we've got is a marital status regime. And that family sociologists, when they measure marital status, this is what they're measuring, is only the third part. So let me go through these steps in a little bit more detail and how they apply to my particular case. So first, everyday acts of recognition, I'm arguing, are the place where marital status is primarily produced. As I've already suggested, this is where marital status and its consequences are primarily lived, and at least some recognition at this level is essential for a marriage to exist as such. So a marriage that's recognized by the state, but whom your neighbors and family don't see as a marriage, is not really what we sociologically tend to mean by marriage. It might be an interesting phenomenon that's worth looking at, but when we as family sociologists are trying to understand marriage, this is not something that would count. It occurs through acts of recognition that produce marital status. What I mean by this could be routine, even unthinking actions as simple as noticing someone's wedding ring, calling someone Mrs. if you think that they're married. Maybe you know, maybe you don't, maybe you're assuming because of the age of the person. And so effectively what you do is construct that woman as a married woman, whether she actually is or not. These acts translate the local semiotic connotations of marital status into concrete consequences. And so what this means is that the set of acts that are relevant will vary across different social settings. So in a place like Makongo, for example, the acts that constitute marital status on an everyday basis would include use of the terms like umakoti and mkwenyana. Umakoti meaning bride or wife, and mkwenyana meaning groom or husband. And one of the interesting things in this particular context is that these terms can be used in ways that extend beyond necessarily the two parties to the marriage themselves. So the father of the bride could call the brother of the husband mkwenyana, and that's an act of recognition that's occurring between two third parties to the marriage, but it's constituting the marriage as such, that the affinal relations, as anthropologists would put it, are constituting the conjugal relationship at its center. And what that does is embody the way that marriage is understood in that particular context, that marriage is understood to be not merely a union of two individuals, but also a set of a larger union of two extended family lines, and that's embodied in the everyday recognizing act. That's not something that's exclusive to an African context, by the way. The notion of in-laws also encompasses a sort of more limited sense of affinality in a Western notion of marriage. Other types of semiotic connotations that can be embodied in these acts would include things like how processual is marriage, or how event-based is it? Crying at a wedding as if this is the moment when you suddenly become married, that's a kind of act of recognition that embodies a sense that marriage is an event in that context. Negotiating over marital status in the way that John Komaroff and others have wrote about embodies the notion that it's processual in that particular context. Notions of the relative patriarchy or gender egalitarian nature of marriage can also be embodied in these kinds of everyday acts. Now, these acts are very consequential. They both symbolically and materially, they condition access to a whole range of resources and obligations, and so for that reason, they tend to attract struggle to influence them. The struggle can play out in a couple different ways. The way that most comes immediately to mind would be organized political struggles over entire categories of relationships. So about what's the policy of the state going to be for customary marriage? Are same-sex marriages going to be recognized or not? Is access to divorce going to be easy or difficult? We've got entire sort of conjugal formations that produce large political struggles in an organized way to influence them. But that's not the only kind of struggle I'm talking about. Also, we can think about everyday struggles over particular relationships. Young lovers who want to get married and their parents don't approve. And so there's a negotiation process between the two of them over whether they can marry or not, and maybe you run away and elope. Negotiations over the obligations that come with being an in-law to a particular marriage. And on a much more localized level, and don't have to do with entire category relationships, only with a particular relationship. But it's important to emphasize these because the effects of them can accumulate over time to produce large-scale shifts in what marriage means. The rise of love as a presumed basis for marriage in many contexts would have played out primarily on this level, for example. The way I come to think of this in its relationship to the broader institutional framework is using the concept of legal consciousness as elaborated by Patricia Ewick and Susan Silby, which is a notion of everyday action that occurs within a particular framework, but because it's enacted by individuals, has the capacity to produce small changes that over time can accumulate and produce larger changes in the way that something's understood. Finally, most important, I think, element of this step is to emphasize that these struggles tend to occur through large-scale regulatory institutions, including in our age, at least globally speaking, primarily the state, but also, of course, religious institutions, cultural institutions, and so forth. And people will tend to turn to these institutions depending on the kinds of technologies and capacities they have, including whatever authority they already are believed to possess over marriage itself. And this is very important because one of the key things to understanding how marriage plays out is that it crosses these institutions, that there's more than one institution that has a claim on defining marriage, and that struggle then within institutions often then turns into a struggle between and among institutions for control over marriage itself. So I'll talk about how this one applies to my research in a little bit more detail, starting with the case of Marital. So there's a long history of struggle over marriage in this context. Both in the broader province and in the Marital itself, and both at the organized political level and at the everyday level, most of the struggle happens through the medium of lobola. Historically, many of you probably know, in KwaZulu-Natal, there's a long history of very rigid, highly codified regulation of African customary marriage, initiated by Theophilus Shepstone in the late 19th century after his own struggles with colonists in the Natal colony that manifest with a certain set of provisions. These included limits on the amount of ilobolo itself. So there was a 10-cow maximum set for the amount of lobola, and any amount over that that was paid as lobola could be seized by the chief of the bride. There was a requirement that all customary marriages be registered with the state. That there had to be the ceremony where the bride was delivered would be seen legally by the colonial state as the wedding. That the ipuisi lenkosi, the police of the chief, would be there, would affirm that the bride consented, and if that happened publicly, then would write down into the registry that the marriage had happened. So that was enacted by Shepstone. Then in the 20th century, after Union and the formation of the Native Administration Act, some elements of this were spread across the country, but not the registration scheme. What did spread across the country was a recognition of customary unions, but not using the term marriage. This is deliberate use of the term union rather than marriage as a way of limiting the state recognition that would be extended to customary marriages. I would like to point this out, particularly when I'm in the United States, because in the same-sex marriage context, the civil union strategy was one that was used early on in that battle, and there was almost a sense that this was the first time ever in history that this has happened, and actually there's a much longer history of exactly this word being used in this way. So the kind of upshot of this in KZN, going through the 20th century, is that customary marriages, meaning marriages that were formed only through lobola and through culturally recognized practices, would only be recognized by the state as customary unions and only for a kind of scattershot collection of purposes. So there was no kind of comprehensive state recognition for those forms of marriages throughout that period, and that was true across the country. What did not spread across the country were these precise limits on lobola and any form of actual registry for marriage. In other colonies and provinces of what became South Africa, this whole process of regulation was less rationalized. It was still thought over in a lot of complex ways, but for reasons that historians have managed to make clear, accommodations between the various parties, which were particularly sort of white patriarchal power and black patriarchal power in black communities, were never able to reach a sort of consensus about how to register and regulate customary marriages, so that never happened, and so they were less rationalized in the rest of the country. Today, as already mentioned, all of these marriages are now recognizable under the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act. It's been in effect in 2001, but it's important to emphasize that this has had very little effect in any part of the country. There are not many marriages that have been registered, and interestingly, most of the ones, the last data I saw from 2013, 70% of the marriages registered under the Customary Marriages Act were registered in KZN. On the everyday level, there are a lot of, today, comes directly from my fieldwork, a lot of generational and gendered struggles over forming recognized marriages. Marriage as an actual practice has completely collapsed in Macrongo, as it has in much of KZN and across the country. And Lobola, interestingly, is sort of blamed for this. So a lot of the thing that my work tries to puzzle through is, why is Lobola still so central to marriage, given that people are blaming it for the collapse of marriage? Nonetheless, it remains absolutely central to it. Young people in my research overwhelmingly wanted to marry for a range of reasons, but a particularly important one was that they spoke of marriage as a potential path to autonomy, of getting away from their parents. So many Lobola processes are begun in Macrongo, but very few are finished, and so people live in what they term engagement, using the English term engagement, for decades, the entire time living with their families, with their parents. And no one is particularly happy about this. The parents want to get rid of the kids, and the kids want to get out from underneath the thumb of their parents. And so marriage is seen, at least at first, as a way to achieve this. Many women and some young men also desire what they call 50-50 marriages. So this 50-50 discourse refers to a sort of notion of gender equality in marriage. Exactly what that means is variable across different folks, but there's at least a sense often among many young women and some men that an ideal marriage is one in which women and men share some decision-making authority over major decisions for the marriage. What's interesting about these two things when paired with Lobola is that young women, and many people have spoken about this in their research, young women are often some of the biggest supporters of Lobola as a practice. And this was true in Macrongo, and even for those women who would say, I want 50-50, Lobola is very important. So how can we make sense of this juxtaposition, what at least from the outside looks like a juxtaposition? And what I argue is that many young women approach Lobola as a kind of process for trying to achieve 50-50 marriages, or at least avoid marriages that are not 50-50. In this way, there are a set of questions that young women have about particular marriages they might get into. One is, what is the economic viability of this marriage going to be? Is this one where there's going to be enough resources for me to live a comfortable life? And the connection between that and Lobola is pretty clear, right? The notion that a young man has the ability to pay enough Lobola to conclude a marriage is an indicator of the kind of access to resources and discipline that he might have in the marriage itself. Beyond that, Lobola takes a very long period of time. And I suggest in the chapter that deals with this, that for many young women, this lengthy Lobola period comes to function as a kind of test of the kind of relationship they might end up having with the man they marry. The initiation of Lobola functions to change the status of the two people vis-a-vis each other. So there's a sense of commitment now, and so then the question is, what will he do with this commitment? Is he going to be egalitarian? Is he going to foster emotional intimacy with me that I hope to have in the home? Or is he going to be selfish, physically abusive, evasive, abandoned, and so forth? There's a sense among many young women that Lobola is a way to see what kind of husband he will be in circumstances where that might not have been as reliable. They couldn't have tested his reliability before Lobola began. And one of the ways this plays out is a kind of architecture in the way that Lobola is understood as a general practice versus particular instances. So there's a set of kind of abstract ideals that young women project onto Lobola as a measure of how committed the man is to the relationship, of how much he values her, and also the sort of affinal, the affinal sort of significances that we know historically come with Lobola as a way of joining two families together, compensating my family for the money and effort they put into raising me, and so forth. That's in the abstract, and then there's a set of worries about particular instances of Lobola. Might this trigger physical abuse? Might this reveal that he doesn't have the discipline to finish the process. So there's a kind of articulation between the abstract ideal and worries about the reality that many young women sort of negotiate through the lobola process itself. And we see this enter in the way lobola is actually practiced. So many young women told me about ways that they sort of behind the scenes tried to influence lobola negotiations. Talking to their mother to send their mother to the father to either lower the lobola amount because they thought this is someone that they wanted to marry and so make sure that it's able to happen, or to pressure someone to ask for payments more quickly, or to give more time for someone whom they thought over time would be able to pay and would be a good husband. Now, as I mentioned, lobola marriages have actually collapsed in practice. As you might imagine, what ends up happening is people end up suspended in this state for a long time, and most lobola processes in the criminal that I encountered, at least in interviews, have sort of faded away. That women have, either their partners have passed away, which isn't necessarily in the process, but at least many women let it end at that point. Sometimes they maneuver out of the relationship through infidelity or other means. Because what happens is a set of the worries that they have before the lobola process become realized, and so they sort of approach this as a way to maneuver out of a relationship that they weren't sure they want to get into now. Turning to the LGBT side of things look quite different. There still is a lot of struggle, but all this struggle has happened via the state, some of it directly and some in terms of state discourses. There's a lot of different ways to tell the history of LGBT communities in South Africa and of same-sex marriage in particular. When it comes to marriage in particular, and LGBT identities in particular, really this is a relatively short history that starts in the 1980s and really picks up speed with the post-apartheid transition and the Constitution, which was the world's first ever to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation. That then triggers a series of impact litigation cases trying to operationalize the equality clause and create a growing, accumulating number of enforceable legal rights around sexual orientation, beginning with the decriminalization of sodomy, going on to various forms of parental recognition, partner recognition for immigration purposes, and so forth. And eventually that ends up producing a case to win same-sex marriage rights. Now that case was actually not brought by the organized movement, and the organized movement was reluctant to bring that case because they weren't sure they were going to win it. But an individual lesbian couple brought the case, and it was ultimately successful. Alongside the impact litigation strategy is the emergence of a rather large and robust set of social movements and non-governmental organizations across the country, facilitated both by people on the ground who increasingly adopt LGBT identities and by financial resources coming in from outside who see the favorable legal environment in South Africa, and so they want to use this to help facilitate the achievement of not only LGBT rights, but a general culture instead of provision of services like health services, education services, and so forth. So that's sort of at the official level. As you undoubtedly know, the translation of the official achievements onto the ground has been uneven at best. South Africa has one of the very strongest legal regimes around LGBT rights in the world now, but the realities on the ground are much more difficult. There's a lot of violence, a lot of discrimination, and people are very much still struggling to get their own identities as LGBT recognized, much less their relationships. So there is a very pessimistic story one could tell. I argue in this project that that's only a part of the story. For the following reasons, that in my research, people who identify as LGBT overwhelmingly exhibited what law and society scholars would call a very strong rights consciousness. And this, in fact, was manifest in the way they would talk about the gap between the legal guarantees and the realities they're experiencing on the ground. So there's a strong sense of law's limits, but also a strong sense of entitlement to law's promises. And then this, I argue, is an indicator of a different kind of subjectivity that's emerged and has become very important and shaping the way that same-sex sexuality and gender nonconformity is lived out in this context today. A strong sense that LGBT identity is important and that one's entitled to have one's rights realized. A very concrete way this manifests is that virtually everyone whom I interviewed who identified as LGBT not only knew that the Civil Union Act existed, but were intimately familiar with various details. There's lots of different provisions about whether you can choose a civil partnership or a marriage. Most of the people whom I interviewed were aware of this provision. So they clearly had a sense of what was available to them in very concrete terms in the statute. Now, it's important to say, I'm not making a claim here, this is true for everyone in the country who has same-sex desire or breaks gender norms. I'm really working here with a subset of people who explicitly have adopted identities as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and or transgender. And it's that identity adoption that really, I think, brings one into the set of processes that helps cultivate this form of rights consciousness. There's a long history in South Africa of other ways of organizing same-sex sexual activity. I can go into that history in the Q&A if you want to hear about some of it. When it comes to LGBT identity and marriage, what LGBT identity really encompasses, the way it's currently articulated, is a sense of a stable inner essence that one cannot change and that therefore needs to be accommodated in some way in order to let it flourish healthfully. And this really feeds right into this notion of rights consciousness, that if one imagines one's same-sex desire in this particular framework and knows that there's a set of legal protections out there, this is really going to shape the way that people behave on the ground. So LGBT-identified people really told this story to me over and over again in a range of ways across racial groups. The details of their struggles were very different across racial and class positions, but the fact of struggles was universal. And one way that this came out was that LGBT people, when I asked them to tell me about their families, almost universally framed that around a narrative of potential expulsion from their families. I did not ask that. I did not ask, is your mom homophobic? I asked, tell me about your mom. And they would say, oh, she's terrible, or actually, I never had a problem with her, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then people would tell me stories about ways they struggled in everyday life to move their families to a new place, and what they regard as a better place in terms of accepting their LGBT identity, or at least carve out some safety if they couldn't do that. And marriage in particular was important for this because many LGBT-identified people spoke of marriage as, in the words of one participant, a bridge between our identities as LGBT and the families of choice who were created that way, and the families of origin within which our place was precarious without it. So marriage plays this role, and the state backing of marriage is important both because of its enforceability and because of the broader set of symbolic connotations attached to the Constitution and rights and respectability of the Constitution. Most of these people are not litigating their place as LGBT people in their own everyday lives. But they are mobilizing rights discourses and identity discourses to try to carve out more recognition at that level. Finally, the resolution of these struggles into a stable regime. So as I suggested before, the kind of struggles I was talking about before, whether political or everyday, eventually will tend to resolve into some kind of stable, if not actually just, equilibrium. And what I mean by that is that such a regime exists when and to the extent that commonly understood terms of marital status recognition exist. So when those everyday acts of recognition that I talked about in step one, when those happen in a way that most people understand them, that they are able to clarify when people fall into one category or another, to the extent that that happens, then you have got an operative regime. These regimes form the basis for everyday acts of recognition the way I've just talked about, and also for the possibility of future struggles. So the idea here is not that it becomes consolidated and that's the end of history, but rather when future struggles happen, then we'll start from a new normal, and the new normal is that which was created in the previous consolidation of the regime. This concept that I'm using here is drawn from the notion of regime in political sociology and political science, which is particularly common in studies of welfare regimes. So the idea that there sometimes are identifiable patterns and principles that underlie a particular nation state's provision of social resources, and that people can classify different nation states into different types of welfare regimes, local regimes, corporatist regimes, and so forth. The welfare history, that's not particularly important for what I'm using here, but what is important are, first of all, the idea that there's a kind of organizing mode of governance that lies underneath the terms on which these resources, in this case, the resources of recognition, are distributed. And also the idea that a regime represents a temporary solidification, a kind of pact between the interest groups who have struggled to produce the regime. So in a welfare context, that might be between, say, labor and capital, right? Here, we could talk about the interest groups of, say, gender rights activists, LGBT activists, and feminists on the one hand, and religious and African traditionalists on the other. That you've got a kind of temporary solidification of the relations of power between those groups, such that you've got an operative regime. But I also move beyond the notion of regime as it's used in the political science literature, because, as you know, because I've insisted on everyday life before, the official terms embodied in official policy, these may or may not actually correspond to the everyday terms that people use in their own everyday lives. So here I'm taking the idea of regime, but detaching it from a necessary association from the state and arguing that the operative regime is one that operates in social life more broadly, including the state, but not reducible to it, also including other institutions and practices. So we'll very briefly talk about how this talks about with respect to customary marriage and same-sex marriage. In Congo, what we see is that the operative regime developed in response to colonial and apartheid rule continues to endure in the post-apartheid era, even despite the passage of the RCMA. So there's continued insistence on lobola today, despite decades of regulation of lobola, and even as marriage rates collapse and people blame lobola for that collapse. Also, particularly interesting in this respect is the continued insistence of what scholars call dual weddings, the use of both a white wedding and a Zulu wedding as being the ideal way to marry. I argue that we can understand the emergence of dual weddings as a kind of innovative response to the non-recognition of customary marriages, as well as the spread of Christian missionaries. So if your customary marriage is not going to be recognized by the state, but you want the marriage to be recognized, what do you do? That you also go into court at the time, or you also go into church and get the formally recognized marriage that are recognized by the state. This is no longer necessary, but it still is what most people in Congo see as the ideal way to get married. Because in a way, I actually would argue that the dual weddings are themselves the operative cultural practice of marriage formation. The white wedding is as much a part of the colonial culture as the Zulu wedding is. For LGBT people, by contrast, we have not yet, in most communities in this country, reached a place where we can speak of a stable, operative marital status regime. There are some contexts where that has happened, depending on the race and class position of the community. And we do see some movement in that direction in, for example, some religious congregations, where in the wake of the legal change, people go to their congregation and say, we would like now to be able to be religiously more married in this temple or in this church. So you see in a few localized places an emerging regime, but in most parts of the country, still these practices remain quite contested and no stable regime has emerged. That said, the struggle is occurring now on different grounds because of what's happened at the institutional level, because the legal rights have shifted and the discourse of the sensitive have shifted. So to pull all this together, essentially what I'm arguing here is that when family sociologists and demographers measure people as married, divorced, and so forth, what they're measuring really is the top of this iceberg that I'm trying to talk about, everything that lies beneath the waterline. They're measuring the operation effectively of consolidated regimes. That's at least if they're doing it right? At least if they're measuring people to be married or not in the terms that they themselves see, then this is what they're measuring. This is not to say that there aren't moments when family sociologists don't encounter exceptions. They find it difficult to assign. In the United States, cohabitation is really where a lot of this action is. So unmarried cohabitants are seen as it's difficult to know if they're actually cohabiting or not because they can't tell you when they started cohabiting and they can't tell you if they split up or not and so forth. Customary marriage sort of occupies this role in the South African context. Family sociologists tend to approach these exceptions as methodological problems and say, How do we figure out the right way to decide if this person is in fact married or if they're not, and how do we count them? That can be a legitimate set of questions to ask, but it leaves a lot of other important questions not asked, including the unexamined power struggles that produce the regime that they're trying to measure in the first place, which then underplays the role of marital status in constructing hierarchies in the work of these sociologists. So for example, I would argue in the US, a lot of the family sociology that's happening now, operating on this set of assumptions, will argue that if people would get married, then their lives would improve. And yes, there's a certain way in which that's true, but they're not asking all the reasons that led into a set of circumstances that associate those sets of benefits with marriage, and therefore they're producing a set of arguments that are problematic. If we think back to Makumalo's story with which I started, this is exactly the set of problems that she presents to us. One can approach her story as a methodological problem. Is she married or is she divorced? But if one asks only that question about her story, one doesn't start to trace the ways that issues of gender, of race, of ethnicity, of religion, of particular locality, of her status within her own kinship network of birth, of her husband's employment. There's a whole set of forces that are really converging to create a certain set of circumstances for her, and which she negotiates to produce an outcome that in her case is actually fairly positive. I think that as sociologists and marrital, what we want to do is really understand how this full complex of processes works to produce stories like hers and stories that are less happy. So then the big questions become, okay, that's one story. How do these accumulate to create new structures of marital status overall? And some further directions that I would suggest for where we could take this would be to look at how these dynamics differ across particular social settings here in South Africa. We know we have snippets from ethnographic work in different parts of KwaZulu-Natal, for example, that practices like Ugana of processual marriage are reemerging in some places. Mark Hunter, I was speaking with a couple of weeks ago, says that Unumlazi, outside of Durban, he's seeing forms of legitimized cohabitation emerge in that context. So even in one province, you've got highly variable practices emerging in different places. Might there be a way to talk about comparative work across these contexts to think about the larger structures that are operating in the country as a whole? And then let's just keep going up to the globe. How do different forms of marriage policy in different jurisdictions around the world translate onto the ground? So I'm imagining for the last chapter of this book project, I'm having some undergraduate students work with me to collect secondary research on marriage policy and practice in Mexico, in France, in Brazil, in China, India, and to think about how would this kind of framework speak to what we see in those kinds of places so that we can think more comparatively. And then finally, we can think about how this sort of analysis can be adapted to study other forms of status that are conferred by the state that play in everyday life. So things like the legitimate adoption of a child, immigration and citizenship status, or even something like property. So that's just the sort of biggest framework to think about further directions we could take this. And I'm looking forward to hearing what direction you want to take it. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Michael. It was a fabulous set of thoughts and arguments. So, yeah, we've got half an hour, 40 minutes for questions and discussion. So we'll take a couple at a time and we'll see how we go. Floor's open. Yankee, Rob, Helen, why don't you just introduce yourselves very briefly and get to your question.
My name is I'm in the department. Thank you for this very inspiring presentation. And I like the example that you used of Mark, especially in the context of KwaZulu-Natal, because I consider that particular province to be highly cultural or traditional, especially in the rural parts of the province. The definition of marriage, for me, is quite problematic, and I think I'd like to answer the question as to whether Mark is married or not married. And the way to answer this question is not by looking at the categories of marriage and divorce. If one follows the customary kind of practice in South Africa, you find that you use the concept of marriage as a process. you find that there are certain rituals or customs that are linked to marriage, which actually defines what marriage is. Such as, if somehow in the process the couple somehow divorces, and the husband marries another woman, when the husband dies, it is not the second woman, wife, that is actually going to mourn the husband. The first wife actually takes the priority. And the reason is, she is the first one that actually married the husband. So she's recognized as part of the family, even though they were separated. And also when they conduct the rituals, like when they get married, there's always a cow that has been slaughtered to introduce the makoti to the family, including the ancestors. Hence they frown upon divorce. So how does one really define marriage in this kind of context where you say, well, let's recognize only those marriages that have like kind of certificates to show that it's a legitimate kind of marriage. When you have those rituals and processes that have to be performed within marriage, that actually defines who are the real partners in this relationship. So I would think that matrimony is still married, regardless of the circumstances that happened between her and her husband. Migrant labor system actually forced African men out of families, and they remain unmarried because of the absence of their husbands for a very long time. But the concept of marriage never stopped. It continued to exist, and the functions that are supposed to be performed by the family or the couples in the marriage have continued to be performed by women in those relationships. So it makes the definition really quite problematic if one has to look at the legal aspect only. There's still the cultural practices or customs or rituals that actually defines what marriage is. Recently we had a case of a famous superstar who was married in KwaZulu-Natal. He was a former Orlando Pirates goalkeeper. When he died, he was living with his parents at this kind of habitation that we're talking about. Then the family just refused to accept this new partner and recognize the first wife. That tells you something about the way in which we tend to think. And we find this not only amongst the Zulus, amongst the Xhosas. I'm a Sutu, and we also find the same thing also amongst the Sutus. And I've actually experienced this with my mother. She was the first wife. My father divorced her, and then he married another wife. He divorced her, and then he married another one. And when things happen in the family will say, well, we want Martiela to be a Christian. Then they will go and fetch her to come and perform the rituals because she is recognized as the Makoti, the original Makoti in the family. So clearly this is a very kind of problematic in terms of understanding without looking at the culture. So I think culture plays an important role in the African context in understanding what marriage is. And I'd like to hear your response to this.
Do you want to take another two before you answer, or do you want to respond now?
I can respond now. I think what you're saying is actually extremely consistent with what I'm arguing. Because I'm trying to displace the centrality of law. I'm saying that to assume that law is central is actually, that's the mistake. With Makumalo, I would say we'll know if she has been married when her husband dies. When we see how her husband's family treats her and the second Makoti. That what I'm sort of advocating here is a kind of methodology that focuses on those moments that are authorized within a particular context to be the moments where you produce, those are the acts of recognition, right? Where you say, we recognize you as having been the wife, and therefore we effectively return you into the wife again with the ceremony. I think that's a sociological way to take that cultural practice and understand how it operates in a particular context. And I think the same thing holds true in non-African contexts. So culture plays an important role in African context. It plays an important role in every context. And effectively what I'm arguing here is that the centrality of law, legal definitions to marriage in, say, the US, where I come from, that's a cultural practice. And that is a cultural practice that's been produced through a set of political processes. And we can understand those better if we acknowledge that. So what I really want to do is kind of break down this notion that sort of cultures over here with a set of people, and in Africa, and that over here we've got rationalized, modernized processes. Instead, what we've got is interpenetration on both sides, and we can use the more visible ways these processes work out in a post-colonial context like South Africa to really understand how they play out around the world.
Rob, yeah. Thanks very much for the presentation. A couple of sort of common questions. Firstly, it's around methodology, I guess, and sort of the sort of dynamics within research and the relations that you establish with people who research. I mean, it particularly struck me when you spoke about, saying you didn't ask a question, is your mother homophobic? And you picked up on issues which they raise, and especially when you're talking about really interesting stuff about young women's investments in the Ebola. I was wondering, what kind of contacts did they arise? Were you interviewing young women with other young women with men as well, with single sex, or what? So something about virtual dynamics. And the other thing that I'd like to raise is, I mean, it's not really part of your paper particularly, but when you're talking about lesbian and gay rights being written into the Constitution in South Africa, and the right to get married, etc. And you sort of touched on the idea of having to prove that's a kind of unchanged kind of essence, I was wondering what's the downside, if you like, of campaigning on behalf of gay and lesbian rights? And because for people who are straight, you don't have to answer the question, are you born straight, or is it the environment that's made you straight? But whereas for gay people,
let's take 2-3 questions and then go to try and keep our stuff moving along. So Helen and then Kule. Okay.
Okay, I'm Helen from this department. I'm more interested in the concept of dual marriages, and I was thinking, did you also kind of explore the influence or the importance of Christianity or religion when it comes to that concept? Because I'm thinking sometimes it may not be just to lay claim maybe to state recognition, because sometimes you think of those that get it or that go to church, the Christians. You have instances where for somebody to get kind of a religious position, you need to go through this process. And then there's also, I'm thinking of another friend who he actually preached about this, that of course you can be customarily married, and then you can also go and get that, or you can go and get the court marriage, but that is not legitimate in the eyes of God. So what then happens is you have to go to your pastor to kind of legitimate your marriage. So I'm particularly interested if you explored that the notion of Christianity.
Hi, I'm Kule. What I found particularly fascinating about this is that you're American, and you really understand. I mean, through your work, you understand a culture and the way things are done that many South Africans don't understand. And so then it comes to the idea of belonging. Where does one know so much about a culture and way of doing stuff that they actually do belong? And can a sociologist ever belong to the people they are studying? Because you're studying Zulu culture. I myself am considered Zulu, but you seem to understand more of my culture than me. So then the question is, is the question of belonging, is it biological, the fact that I've got 2 Zulu parents, or is it actually a fact of knowledge?
Actually, yeah, that's a good question. So let's take the other questions and then we'll come for another round. Unless you want to tag on to one of these questions. So how do you?
Can you take another question? Would you rather?
If it's not on these 3, then let me deal with these 3 first. Otherwise, I'll get a little too excited with my train of thought. The question about method and the question about belonging actually link to each other, I think. So just in terms of interviewing technique, one thing you might have picked up on a little bit is that I really tried to open the interviews themselves as neutrally as I possibly could to avoid trying to lead anyone down a particular direction or not. So the actual kind of oral history interviews about people's kinship, and this oral history is the right way to put it. It's more like a David Schneider, Kath Weston kind of technique of identifying kinship networks. And I started by asking, of all the people in your life, who's the most important to you? Just as a way of saying, okay, we're going to talk about important relationships, but I'm not going to assume that marriage is important. I'm not even going to assume that family is important, so on and so forth. And I did that not because I was necessarily interested in the answer to that question per se, although a lot of times those answers were interesting. And the most common answer was mother, in case you're interested. But as a way of kind of getting into the topic without loading the dice too much. And the same thing comes up what I mentioned about the sort of question of the homophobic mother and that kind of thing. But you asked more about the kind of context in which the interviews happened. And I think this is a really important question because the context on the two sides are sort of necessarily very different. Because the kind of social groups we're talking about is different on each side. If you're talking about customary law, that's something that is lived in a specific kind of place, right, a geographical setting. Customary law operates in a particular village, for example. And so for that and also logistical reasons, there's no way that I could have possibly done some sort of cross-country customary marriage study in 1 year. I chose to sit down in one particular village and do the research there. That also is linked to this question of belonging and sort of cultural knowledge, right? In order to really sort of understand what's happening in this context, it was necessary for me to stay in one place for a much longer period of time to understand what culture means, including not to assume what culture means just because of what the ethnographers had told me from before. I do try to triangulate what I see in the Congo off of other work that's happening from other people in other parts of the province and the country. And so I talked a little bit about that with Mark Hunter's work and Ben Cousins' work and Ben's work and so forth, right? That there's somewhat different patterns emerging in different places, and so I can talk about the scope of my claims. The question about the interview context itself, though, comes out of this. In Monroe, I did all of the interviews in Isizu myself, but Isizu was an incredibly difficult language. So I did that with the help of interpreters who were from the village. And so what we typically did was they would actually ask one of their friends to be interviewed, and the three of us would sit down together. And I did this after considering a lot of different options of bringing in an interpreter from outside the village or doing it alone and so on and so forth. And I landed on this as the one that was the approach that was most likely to get me the level of trust I needed to do the interviews, the level of language proficiency I needed to understand exactly what was going on to be able to respond appropriately. And also, in a sense, to kind of, to the extent possible, which is still a limited one, but to kind of replicate the kinds of conversations that they already have, right? Friends are speaking with each other about these kinds of things all the time, particularly when it comes to stuff about Lobola and young women's relationship to it. So it was very clear. What would often emerge in interviews was a conversation between my interpreter and the person I was interviewing about like how much Lobola costs in this village versus how much it costs in that village up the road, and that village up the road, and they're going to get married, and here they are. Now I'm present. So it's not a completely natural sort of setting, but it was, of the options available to me, was I think the closest I could get to that. And because I was staying in the village, these were people I came to know over time also. And I often found sometimes that the most interesting material came out, not during the interview itself, but once we'd done the interview, then we would run into each other on the road, and they would tell me some kind of story that had come up, because by that point, you sort of established a level of rapport and trust. We're going to talk about it then. When it comes to the LGBT context, it's very different, because for LGBT people, given what we know about the way that this plays out in this country, it's highly influenced by race and class, and so I really wanted to make sure I was interviewing a kind of diverse range of participants across racial and class positions. And it's not the kind of thing that's lived out in itself in a geographically tied away. And so I don't mean by that geographically doesn't inflect the way that LGBT plays out, but it's not the identity that's the place, right? It's the place, and then the identity kind of interacts with the place. So that meant was that a lot more of those interviews were sort of one-off interviews. A number of them were people whom I developed relationships through other means or through the course of this research, but a lot of them were not. I interviewed them once, did the interview, and kind of walked away. And so I have to be really mindful of that when I'm interpreting some of this data. This links back in some ways to Kule's question about belonging and sort of social distance. Because I'm myself openly gay, and so I come into these interviews knowing a little bit about what the experience is like and able to sort of speak back to the stories that people are telling me in a certain kind of way. That was much harder to do in Congo. I mean, it existed. Someone's mom has passed away, and I can talk about my mom passing away and so forth. But the cultural practices in that particular context were more distant from me than the particular kind of LGBT-related struggles that people were telling me about in that context. So that somewhat mitigated the problem of the one-off interview a little bit. That said, there's still something I'm worried about with it, which is that there's a danger of kind of assuming too much familiarity, that I come in as a gay person and that I know what that means in this context, when it could mean other things. And that kind of gets to your other question about inner stable identity and what are the downsides. I think there are a lot of downsides to an LGBT paradigm. In particular, I think that those downsides tend to channel expressions of sexuality and gender expression in particular directions that have certain benefits. I mean, they form a basis for political action. They form kind of recognizable, cognizable, and legible sort of legal categories that we can address legally. But those may not be the expressions that are the most suitable for everyone in every circumstance. So there's a lot of work in sexualities research on what are called tacit negotiations in other contexts around the world, where people engage in same-sex sex and then live with a different sex spouse, for example. And the same-sex sex doesn't take on a larger identity significance for them, and they're able to kind of eke out a space that works for them in that context. There's histories of that here in South Africa. Those histories, I think, have been pushed aside, mostly by homophobic colonial regulation, both from religious and state officials, but also because now LGBT identity kind of occupies a lot of the space that could have been occupied by these sort of more tacit negotiations. There still are a lot of tacit negotiations going on in South Africa, but under different circumstances, because now there's a different set of ideological and legal formations that they have to contend with that in the 19th century would not have existed. So I think with any time there's a kind of social shift, like there's doors that open and there's doors that close. And so I can kind of go from there, I think, to the belonging question. I'm not sure how well I understand Congo culture is how I put it. I won't say Zulu culture. Because I think there's a lot of questions. I mean, Zulu culture is contested. All culture is contested. And I think that's really the one thing I would insist on. There are people in this context who would say to me, this is the progression. This is the way Lobola must proceed. These are the ceremonies, and this is what they mean, etc. And actually, that was a challenge for me because I was coming from the outside, right? You're going to go home to the US and you're going to teach people what Zulu culture is. I'm like, okay, well, tell me what you say Zulu culture is. Now tell me what you did, right? Now tell me what happened in this particular Lobola process. And as with all legalities, state or non-state, there's a gap between the sort of stated ideological articulation and the reality. And it was sometimes, I think, hard for me to get to that because of my outsiderness, in a sense. And the other kind of answer I would give to that is that I realize I'm starting to write this in particular. So now I'm going to put things on paper and then be going out in public, and some people will be reading them and crediting them as if this actually says something real about these people's lives. And so I'm becoming really conscious about what are the nature of my relationships? What are my affective relationships? What are my kinship relationships with the families that I stayed with while I was doing the research, right? Because I lived there for a long time. We did develop a series of obligations, and I think affection But I also know that people would kind of use me to send messages to other parts of the family and so forth. There's a kind of strategic relationship that people adopt towards you as a field worker when you're doing that. And so I have to think very carefully about the nature and extent of my belonging. So it's never something I would say is sort of like, here's a line and I'm on this side, and no, I'm on that side. I'm not Johnny Clegg, right? You know? Instead, trying to be aware of the extent to which and the context in which maybe I belonged more and was able to access more, and those in which I probably learned less, and really be mindful in that in terms of how I'm interpreting the work. And this gets back to Helen's, I think, really good question about dual marriages. I would use the phrase dual weddings rather than dual marriages. The literature tends to use dual marriage, but I think dual weddings better. Because I do think there's a series of ceremonies that people go through, but that doesn't mean that people think of their marriages themselves as being kind of one or the other or a combination of both, right? I'm married and I'm living out a married life, and the weddings are the ceremonies that kind of mark that progression. When it comes to the role of religion in that, I do think you're right, this is very important. The biggest theoretical answer I would give is that insofar as someone's getting married in a church because that's what's needed to have that status in that church, to have the marriage recognized by the church and to be recognized by God, that's actually parallel to the story I'm telling about the state, right? That if you think that you need state recognition, then you get a wedding that's recognized by the state in order to achieve that recognition. Same thing with the church, which is also an institution of a kind. Now, those institutions, that field is shifting over time. This particular village is, almost everyone is Christian. Historically, most people used to be mainline denominations, so either Catholic or some version of Protestant. There's a rise of syncretic denominations, so the Shinbei Church is on the rise, and ZCC, Zulu Congregational Church in this context, not is it Zionist Christian Church, right? So in those contexts, you actually have ceremonies that are seen as simultaneously, there's a kind of shift. The religion is no longer associated with the state, and that's coincident in one ceremony. Instead, the religion is associated with the cultural ceremony, and that's coincident in that ceremony. Because that shift happened recently, and because marriages declined, I did not counter any examples with the exception of the chief himself, who actually married in a syncretic African church recently. So I don't know what they do. Do they also then go down to home affairs to get the state recognition or not? The chief, I'm pretty sure he probably did, because there's a lot of property at play. But the others, I'm not sure. There's one example I know of a woman who, it's not a religious context, but she authorized her daughter to go to home affairs and register their marriage, even though the lobola hadn't been completed, because she didn't want the groom to be living by himself anymore. But she considers this to be kibita, right? They're still cohabiting. She just thinks, that's fine with me, and he better keep paying the lobola. So that's the only thing that comes close to answering your question concretely. Someone in this room is a postgrad student. You should go out and research this question, because I think it's really important.
That's great. Sylvia, you have a question, Bernard. Should we ask now?
Yeah, actually, maybe my question was linked to
Okay.
to those questions. But you pointed in the last part of the presentation to how the analysis could be adapted to other areas, right? And I work on housing, land, property. You went to property, and I think it's interesting because I think my work has been similar in the sense that I've looked at ways that people make claims on land and property in the legal pluralist context, which is actually quite similar. But I looked at other literatures, and there is in the area of land and property there is some interesting stuff there. But I thought, so kind of thinking from my own work, I was wondering, and I like the term that you use, this acts of recognition. So basically, these everyday practices and how they contribute to laying or recognizing certain claims on certain claims, right? So I was just curious, and maybe that's where the dual wedding comes in. What kind, in terms of the acts of recognition, whether you saw, what are the kind of new strategies or acts that come up there to recognize these claims? In this case, in your research on marriage, you hinted to some of that, but I was just wondering what else. And also, because when you start looking at that, maybe sometimes you also see kind of new players and actors that come up, new authorities that contribute to recognizing certain claims. And here also, I mean, and those are the power dynamics that you touched on. So maybe in that case, that's the church that comes in as a new player. So maybe you could elaborate a bit more on that.
Thanks, Michael. Fabulous presentation. I'm struggling to formulate a question entirely, but I'm certainly interested in the kind of historical dynamics that are at play here. I mean, one aspect that does come to mind is thinking about the increasing importance of documents, of paper, of biometrics, of regimes that are associated with the law but are not necessarily identical to it. That one might need to travel, that one might need to claim property. And I'm wondering how that mode of recognition might be transforming. It's provided us wonderful moments of these tensions. But I wonder if you could think of one direction. The other side of that is the paradox, perhaps, the insistence on the boiler at the moment in which people are not getting married. I mean, do you think that paradox is something that would continue, or that in fact it might push against that insistence at some moment? So it's not ethnographers tend not to sort of predict and think forward, but some sociologists do. So if I could push you to think about this dynamic.
So, third question here. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your paper. I was just thinking, if you were to sit on an expert panel with Statistics South Africa and give them advice for the next census, what to include on marital status, what is your response and your advice? You will be paid for your advice.
Yeah, take the money. So by the way, it is in fact 27 past, so we have a few minutes, so we can take as much time to finish this, but we can continue these conversations with the reading group, which will start in about 20 minutes time. So there's lots of great questions which still ask, but maybe we'll wrap up with this round. We'll carry on later.
So starting with the question, Sylvia's question. The land context is really important here because there's actually been more innovation when thinking about land on these questions than there has been about marriage, as you would know, right? So for those of you who don't know, there's a set of in legal scholarship and also anthropological scholarship, kind of disaggregating the kinds of rights over land. So the right to alienate or sell land, the right to use land, the right to steward land, and thinking about those as things that are potentially at least separable as a way of kind of decomposing the concept of property, which sort of is the analogy to marriage, right? The kind of unified whole. So I think that's absolutely right. I wonder, one thing I worry about with this argument that I'm making is that, for many reasons, including strategically, I framed it as being about marital status. And if doing that in that way is already kind of giving away too much ground in this way, because one could potentially disaggregate marriage into a set of other kinds of relationships and rights. I haven't done that for two reasons. One is, I think these reasons are linked. There's already kind of a history, an older history, including in John Comrock's piece that I circulated for the reading group. I'm actually criticizing that way of thinking about marriage in the first place, right? The jural approach to marriage, and so that when marriage is transferring of rights, and so if you disaggregate to rights, as being too legalistic, right, in a sense, that and too kind of instrumental and functional. And so I don't want to decompose marital status in a way that lands me into a set of problems that people have already solved effectively. More substantively, what I think is going on is I think I do think in many contexts, and my argument only applies in those contexts to which this is true, there is a kind of unity to marriage in a way that is not necessarily the property, right? It means something to be married, and it means something that is different from being unmarried, that there is a kind of distinction, and so the status of being married applies insofar as that distinction is a valid one, a legible one. And I tend to think that this goes a little bit to Werner's question. I tend to think that if we look in global terms, this is generally increasing over time. So I think in some ways, the story of customary marriage is sort of at the heart of this paper. It drives the whole project epistemologically, both in itself as kind of process and event, but also historically. I think the process of the colonial state taking kind of more and more control over marriage is kind of a good lens to think about statecraft in general and its relationship to kinship, including in the United States, in Europe, and so forth. And that statecraft plays out in direct material sort of strategies, which is, I think, where the link with property comes in, right? We will recognize and enforce these set of rights. But also, then the question is, what about the ideological sort of effects of that in the way people imagine themselves as subjects? And there, I see some move. So I see in Mapungo, marriage is an event in Mapungo. It's not a process. There's an engagement process, but if I'm not shadide, I'm shadide, right? I'm not married. So marriage is an event, so we can see the kind of residue of that colonial process, but we can still see a set of negotiations that indicates that their subjectivities have not been fully colonized by the way that the colonial state regulated marriage. Right? There still is this kind of way of imagining marriage that still exists to some degree outside of the state. So your question kind of provokes for me that set of kind of worries I'm having about the way I'm framing this. And I think that is sort of one of the downsides to what I'm saying. You asked about new strategies, and the ones that come most immediately to mind are in the LGBT context and the Ebola, where within marriages involving at least one African partner, there are more interracial relationships, at least so far as we know in the US. This is true in same-sex contexts, and I think this is probably true, but we don't have the statistics to prove this is true in South Africa. So there are sometimes interracial relationships across same-sex lines. Whether that's true or within it, what we see is a range of innovations emerging for how Ebola is practiced. And this is really something that someone needs to look at more closely than I was able to, because I was interviewing single people even, right? So I'm not looking at marriage processes themselves, but some of the people I talked to were in the process of getting married, and often Ebola was exchanged in one way or another, most commonly from the more masculine partner to the more feminine partner. So there is a kind of direct kind of translation of Ebola processes into the same-sex context. But I also encountered examples where people would exchange rings and give them the name Ebola, right? So people would take a kind of set of cultural languages and apply them to each other as a way of trying to make legible the practices within their own context. And so then the big question is, because marriage is always embedded to some degree within extended networks, whether it's extended family networks or not, who accepts these practices and how and to what extent? And that's, I think, where really the research has to be done. This particular example that I just mentioned of the rings being exchanged in called Ebola, in that context, the family accepted it, at least so far as I was told by the person they interviewed. It could be in other contexts that would be different. And this kind of takes me into Werner's questions about historical dynamics. Paper is increasingly important because people are increasingly around people they don't know. I mean, and there's a long history of this. That's a story of migrant labor and colonialism and apartheid, right? And I think that's a lot of the story about what's happening to customary marriage is really that story. And the role of paper in that, or now the computer, right, is really kind of fascinating there. It raises methodological questions for me. So how do I know that's not what they regard as the marriage being made? How do I know that they say the marriage has been made? That it just has to be proven with paper. And I think actually in that particular context, the verb fagab does a lot of that work for me. The idea that you're taking something that exists but then putting it in somewhere indicates that the way they're thinking about it. Paper is, I think, very important. Sayina is the word that people would use to like indicate, so signed. I signed the paper that the marriage was in fact complete. I would say you're not married. Sometimes people not, we do not sign. Así sainile. So there is that. And there's a literature in law and society about the role of paper in kind of legal subjectivity. So I tie that to this here. The thing that I kind of think back to though is the paper wife, right? That's so under colonialism and apartheid, a migrant laboring husband who moved to town marries someone under the civil law, and that wife would sometimes be called a paper wife as a way of delegitimizing the validity of that wife, right? So there's actually a kind of ironic kind of turning of the power of paper. And maybe this speaks to the fact that I think paper is a technique of regulation, and people feel regulated by it, and so they adopt kind of different stances toward that regulation. And maybe that's a kind of ironizing of that in that sense. The direction I think over time is going to be towards, I think, generally more certainty in marital status, which I'm cutting against the sort of idea here of like the states dissolving. I actually think states are, at least when it comes to kinship, getting more and more power over kinship relations. Did you? Okay. But the other sort of, what's the direction in terms of lobola centrality? This is where I think, I was surprised not to see more development of kind of, I lived in a cohabiting family, so cohabitation is there, but it's called kipita, it's kind of giggled about, it's not really shameful, but it's giggled about. But I was surprised not to see more of it. Mark Hunter is convinced that he's finding it now in Lazi, legitimized cohabitation. I tend to think these pressures are going to create an endpoint. And so what he suggested to me as a way of kind of explaining variation was about land. This goes back to the question about land. Congo is a place where there's, land pressures are big, but for a lot of complex historical reasons that I don't have time to go into, there's a long history of the chiefs giving out land pretty freely there, and including to single women, including single women with only daughters, happening right at 94, so right with the constitutional change. The mother of the chief is the mayor of the local municipality, and she's a big ANC figure, and she's, I don't know if she used the word feminist, but she sends the kids in the village just like soaking ginger justice sort of workshops and stuff. So access to marriage in legitimized sort of cohabitation is not necessary to access land in this context, and so maybe that's why lobola kind of remains around and people don't get married and are okay with this disjuncture. But in places like Msinga or Mwazi, you see different innovations emerging because the relationship to land is different. That would be a highly materialist sort of explanation, which I tend not to favor, but I do think it's probably is playing a part. No, that's the toughest question. What would I say to stats essay? Oh God, I would say hire a bunch of ethnographers. I don't have a good answer for this. Actually, in some ways, I would answer that. I would say we don't know how to answer this until we do more ethnography across the country. That is what I would say. I mean, this is what I was saying to Thomas earlier. I think this is highly localized, the way marriage is defined. If I were to settle on one kind of easy answer for a quantitative sociologist to ask, it would be to self-identify the way we do with race. But I think there are problems with that. One problem is are you only married if you're married, or I'm saying really other people have to recognize you as married. So do you ask other people if they're married? And maybe that's the answer. And then the second one goes back to Sylvia's question about decomposition. Is it really like, are you married, or is it about what do you have access to in terms of kinship, right? Because maybe if you ask if someone's married, they might say no, but that might be, this is Debbie Gutlander's written about this, right? Like there might be somewhere in the process of marriage, and in certain contexts they would say yes, but to someone coming up in the door they would say no. So I think self-identification is the best answer I could give, but I think it's still highly problematic, and that's why we need more ethnographers. How's that for a dodge?
Great. Well, thanks very much for a great talk and great discussion. And, you're all invited to take part in the reading group if you want to come to that, which will be just next door. And,